behavior in random strangers. There are a number of reasons why the assumption of rationality might sometimes work better than you would expect if you have observed that people are sometimes not rational. And one reason is that in some contexts, random irrationality averages out. So if you imagine a situation where economics says if this happens, people will buy more of the, if the price of a good goes down, people will buy more of it. Well, some people, for sort of irrelevant reasons, buy less or more, but that's going to roughly average out. And also there are some contexts where the people who are making a decision have been selected for being rational. So people do not become CEO of a corporation at random. And on the whole, if you are the CEO of a corporation and do not do a good job of maximizing that corporation's profit, it is likely either you will lose the job or the corporation will cease to be an important part of the economy. So if you look at it as a survivorship effect, you would expect that rationality is a better description, particularly being rational about maximizing profit is a better description than one might expect in general. And it's not limited, as I say, to humans. For example, I don't know if any of you have ever had a cat as a roommate, but if in the morning you are paying attention to reading the newspaper when you should be petting the cat will solve the problem by lying on the newspaper. That is indeed the correct solution, probably determined by trial and error. Similarly, babies are rational. Some of you may have been a baby at one point in your life, and if you imagine yourself as a 3-month-old baby, you have only one tool for controlling the world, and that's your voice. So when you are wet or hungry or uncomfortable, you make loud, unpleasant noises, and big people come and fix the problem. And that again is rational behavior within the constraints of the very limited tools. Let me give you an example which some of you already heard because I used it in my earlier talk on a different subject, but I'm assuming this isn't all the same people. And that's why armies run away, why soldiers often don't aim their guns. If you imagine that you are one of 10,000 men, this is 1,000 years ago on the other side of the Atlantic, and you're one of 10,000 men with spears, and you're pointing the spears that way, and the reason you're doing it is another 10,000 men with spears on horseback are coming at you, and you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if we all stand and keep our spears planted, with luck we will break their charge. Some of us will die, but many of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said, if we all. I don't control him and him. I only control me. If I run and everybody else stands, one man out of 10,000 has very little effect on whether we stop the charge, and I'm not going to be one of the ones who gets killed stopping the charge. If they run and I stand, I'm dead. Whatever the rest of the army is doing, it's in my interest to run. And then we all run. Most of us die. Think of it as the dark side of rationality. That is the result of rational behavior, even though it's individual rationality, not group rationality. That was my talk, and my subject of my other talk was situations like that where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality. Similarly, let's take a modern version of the same logic. You're in a foxhole in Korea or somewhere about then, and what you're supposed to be doing is watching for an enemy, aiming at him and shooting. This is a very dangerous thing to do, right? Whereas if you do this instead, the officer won't know the difference. With luck, that'll keep their heads down and you won't get shot. This explains, anybody know what the ratio is of rounds fired to people killed in modern warfare?
75,000?
Depends on the war. 35,000, 100,000, that kind of number. It's enormously higher than you would normally imagine. And part of it is machine guns and things, but a lot of it is people firing shots to make other people keep their heads down and not actually aim. So this is what economists call the public good problem, the situation where I am taking an action which benefits other people and I can't charge them for it because I can't control whether they get it, and that's the public good problem on the battlefield. You didn't even know that was economics. Economics of politics. If you think about how the political system, democratic system is supposed to work, there's a very simple theory, which I think of as the civics class model of democracy. And that is that politicians have to do the right thing, because if they don't, we'll vote them out. And the problem is that in any except a very simple polity, knowing whether the politician's doing the right thing is a non-trivial problem. And oddly enough, politicians never run saying, I'm the bad guy. They always introduce their bills in a way which implies they're good for practically everybody. As far as I know, nobody has ever introduced a bill to the U.S. Congress entitled a bill for making farmers richer and city folks poorer. Although, in fact, that is what the farm program is really designed to do. I don't think that anybody described the biofuels program as a program to make food more expensive, but it is in fact the U.S.'s main contribution to global hunger, because we are the largest producer of maize and corn in the world, and something like, I think, a third or a quarter of that is turned into alcohol, which means that the world supply of maize is reduced, I don't know, about 10% or something. It's a non-trivial event. But why are, not only is it hard to know, there is no incentive to know, because you as an individual voter, except in a very small polity, know that the chance that your vote will change the outcome is in the Senate very, very close to zero, maybe 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million in a presidential election. It's true that if you do result in the better candidate getting elected, that could do an enormous amount of good, but most of that good is to other people. So it's again a public good problem where you're doing a good job of studying who to vote for would be producing a benefit, most of which goes to 330 million other people, maybe more if he's good for the world as well as the country. So the result is that most voters are rationally ignorant, and it's indeed rational to be rationally ignorant. That's why we call it rational ignorance. I've been reading a very interesting article, fairly old article, but I was rereading it for something that I was writing, by somebody who offers evidence that on an issue like evolution or global warming, the more scientifically able somebody is, the more likely he is to agree with his social group, whether that means believing in evolution or not believing in evolution. He's actually got these neat graphs showing how the probability of believing in evolution, as you increase scientific sophistication, goes up for the non-religious and goes down for the religious. And the basic argument is that it's rational to choose your belief not by what's true, but by what is in your interest to believe. And if you're in a community where they know that people who believe in evolution are not to be trusted, then the sensible thing is to persuade yourself to believe in evolution. So it feels perverse. Yep.
What about a local race where you know people and people know you are knowledgeable?
At that scale, it might make sense to do things, but that doesn't describe very large parts of our polity. So, given that voters are rationally ignorant, they are going to either support policies that sound good, which politicians are good at constructing, or the policies they know that those who they care about are in favor of, and you end up with a politics of sound bites and demagoguery, which we can observe pretty routinely. That's economics. All right, that's economics. What's called public choice theory is economics applied to understanding political institutions. Another piece of public choice theory is thinking about the market for government favors. Suppose the question is whether to have an auto tariff, that is to say, a tax on the importation of autos. It turns out that the relevant economics were worked out by David Ricardo just about 200 years ago, maybe 206 years ago or so, and have been understood by economists ever since. And those economics imply that under most circumstances, a tariff-based country is imposed. There are imaginable exceptions, but that's the normal result. But if you think about it not from the standpoint of what's in the interest of the population, but what is politically attractive, the tariff provides a benefit to a very small number of players, the auto companies and the auto union. That's a small enough number so that if their lobbying is going to produce a benefit for 6 of them, they can reasonably well get together and say, look, I'll chip in some money, if you chip in some money, and if you union agree to get your people to vote for the politicians who support our auto tariff, the cost is being borne by all consumers of autos, and less obviously all producers of export goods, because if we import less, we'll export less. But that's most of the population. That's a very, very dispersed group, and the result is that it is not practical, even though their cost is much larger than the benefit to the auto companies, for them to in fact organize to buy the legislation they want, which is to prevent the tariff. It's a very common pattern, such that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated interest groups at the expense of dispersed interest groups, even if the cost is much larger. And this is part of the reason that I have a chapter in Machinery of Freedom on the non-existence of the ruling class. That the right way to think of it is not there is a set of people who as individuals are powerful and they get government to benefit them at the expense of others. There are rather interest groups, and the same person who, as a member, as an executive of an auto company, is part of a concentrated interest group and gets benefited, as a passenger in an airplane prior to deregulation is part of a deregulated interest group and is getting transferred away from by the fact that the CAB cartelized the airline industry and thus raised airline fares. So I think I like to describe it as a thieves market, where everybody is stealing from everybody else at considerable costs. Another implication of this, if you think about the question of what will give you long time horizons versus short-term, and suppose the question is, should we plant black walnut trees, which are slow-growing trees that give very valuable walnut. And let's imagine that it takes 30 years for black walnut trees to mature. I'm currently 76. In 30 years, I will not be alive unless they solve the aging problem, which I keep hoping for, but I'm not counting on. You do realize that all of you are dying of a lethal disease, unfortunately, as everybody else so far. But nonetheless, it might well pay me to plant those walnut trees. Why? Because 10 years from now, I can sell them to somebody else. That somebody else, if he wants, can wait another 10 years to sell them to someone else. So that means it pays me to take account of benefits that occur beyond my lifespan for purely selfish reasons. That's a sort of a neat factor of the market. But that depends on secure property rights. If there's a substantial chance each day that either some private entrepreneur will drive onto the field at night and cut down my trees and truck them away, or that some more enterprising political entrepreneur will persuade Congress that black walnut trees are a public resource that should be nationalized, then it won't be. Yep.
But what about your son? What if you pass these walnut trees on to your son?
I could do that, but even if I had no sons, it would still pay me. My point is, you don't need I don't need to care about people into the future in order to make plans. But now think about politics. Politicians have, in a sense, property rights. They've got certain kinds of powers in their office, but they're very insecure property rights. That Clinton could rent out the White House, but he couldn't sell it. That a politician who does politically costly things now, which will produce valuable benefits that the voters will appreciate 20 years from now, knows that 20 years from now, someone else will be in his office, very likely someone of the opposite party, so it is not in his interest to do that. So politicians talk about long-term future plans, but what they worry about is what's the inflation rate could be in the next election, what's the unemployment rate could be in the next election. Why do politicians talk about the future? They talk about the future because it's invisible. Because if you are getting people, if you are in fact making people worse off, you have at least the possibility of persuading them that this is a sacrifice being made so that their children will be better off. And unlike the current circumstance, they can't observe it. And I think the person who's sort of the poster child for this strategy would be Joseph Stalin. That he could not persuade the people in Moscow who were living one family to a room that they were well off. But he could for a while persuade them that this was the sacrifice that they were making in order to develop the communist economy so that their children would be richer than the Americans. You can't keep it up forever, but they kept it up for a noticeable while. Let me take a number of other cases outside of politics. let me talk about the economics of sex and marriage. Let's start with the problem in that market. And the problem in that market is that it's a barter market. And if you think of ordinary barter, if I want to get fed dinner, and what do? I teach economics. On a barter market, I have to find somebody who both wants to learn economics and is selling dinners, as it were, which is much harder than what I can actually do, which is to sell my skills to one person and use the money to buy from another. All right? Well, if you think about it, marriage is an inherently barter market. I'm married to you, you're married to me. So you have to find not merely someone you want to be married to, or want to sleep with, or want to date, whatever the activity is, but somebody who also wants to do the same thing to you. And that's a much harder problem. And that explains why so many people are single who don't want to be, don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend, or whatever.
And prostitution.
Prostitution is a partial monetary one, but it's still the case that the prostitute is having sex with somebody. After all, if you do sex right, it's profitable for both parties. So the result is long search times and a lot of frustrated people. Let me keep going. Why is marriage a long-term contract? I should say it took me about 6 years to convince the woman I've now been married to for I think 35 years of the virtues of long-term contracts. But I eventually did. I have always regretted that when I was living in Los Angeles and she was living in New Orleans, and we were talking on the phone and she said she thought we ought to get married, that I wasn't quick enough to say that's a great idea. Why didn't I think of that when I've been proposing to her for the last 5 years or so? But let's think about long-term contracts in general. Marriage is a long-term contract. Traditionally one very hard to get out of, less true nowadays. Why do you have one? So imagine that I take a job at UCLA and I move to Los Angeles. And in doing that, I bear a variety of costs. I bear moving costs. I bear the cost of figuring out how to teach UCLA students, of making a new set of friends. Which means that the price they have to pay me to move is higher than the price that they have to pay me to keep me. But the same thing is true in the other direction, because they have to bear costs to adjust to me. They have to figure out which of their classes I'm good at teaching. They know that the first year or so I'm not going to be very good because I'm just fitting myself in and so forth. So you could imagine that after I've been there a year or two, the chairman calls me into his office and he explains to me about the tight budget of the economics department and suggests renegotiating my salary now. And I'm happy to be called into his office because I've been thinking about the other half of that, and I want to renegotiate my salary up. So that suggests that we started out on a competitive market. I could have been hired by any university, they could have hired any economist. But we are now in a bilateral monopoly because we are now in a situation where, because of the sunk costs both sides have made, I am better off with UCLA than with the random university, and they're better off with the random professor. And the standard solution is you have either by law or by custom long-term employment contracts where it's understood that it's not legitimate for either of us to try to renegotiate unless something outside has changed. If I got an offer from Harvard for a higher salary, I can go to the chairman and try to renegotiate, but not short of that. Well, same situation with marriage. I get married. My wife has to learn to live with me, which is a non-trivial project, I can assure you, or she can assure you. I should say it's my wife's opinion that the reason that I ended up marrying her, I should say I met her when she was a graduate student and I was the first man she had ever dated, was that she had an invisible, not interested in these things, aura around her. And I was too socially incompetent to see it. Which may be right. Anyway, so I have to learn to get along with her. She has to learn to get along with me. We acquire various sorts of joint property. We have friends in common. We have a house we're both living in. We in particular produce children who are now a joint property, which is very costly to split up. We now have a bilateral monopoly with potential bargaining, and that problem is reduced if there is an understanding that you don't have the viable threat of I'll leave if you don't improve my condition. So therefore marriage is conditional. That's all economics. Let me go on to explain the institution of engagement rings. This is based not on my thoughts or work, but on a very good article by Peggy Friedman. Anyway, premarital sex, contrary to what everybody believes, is not a modern invention. However, the traditional arrangement was that premarital sex was conditional on a commitment to marry if the woman got pregnant. Because in the society that existed until roughly your lifetimes, loss of virginity was quite expensive for a woman. It made her less attractive on the marriage market. Consequently, it was a serious cost for her to be seduced and abandoned. Not a serious cost for the man. Got some pleasant sex without getting tied down. And therefore there were various institutions to make sure that seduce and abandon was not an easy option for the man. And in fact, there used to be a legal penalty. It used to be possible to sue a man for breach of promise to marry. And that, from the economist's standpoint, was really a damage payment for loss of virginity. Although it wasn't put in those terms. As of about the 1930s, U.S. courts, state courts, started abandoning that action. Why, I don't know. That's what happened. Peggy Friedman in this article. Her argument was that the solution was a performance bond. The solution was the custom, which she argued only arose then. She's got data on diamond sales, which is using just attractives. And it is at that point that it begins to become a normal custom for ordinary people that if you want to get engaged to a girl, you have to give her an expensive diamond ring. And if you jilt her, she's going to keep the ring. So it's a performance bond. The custom has become much less common now because loss of virginity is no longer a large cost on the marriage market due to modern society with different sexual rules. Furthermore, we've got good contraceptives, so the woman is not likely to get pregnant if she doesn't want to. And so on. Just economics. Margaret Brinnig and her article is called Rings and Promises. Let me give you another example from a different economist, a friend of mine, Lloyd Cohen, about economics of marriage and problems with marriage. Suppose you imagine two firms which have a joint project, and the deal is that one firm performs its part of the project early, and the other firm performs its part of the project late. If the contract is not enforceable, there is the risk that the second firm, having gotten the benefit of what the first firm did, will then drop out of the contract and never give them their share. All right? Think about traditional marriage. In traditional marriage, the wife is performing her half of it early because it is the wife in the first 10 or 20 years who is bearing children and bringing them up. And as some of you have probably discovered experimentally, bringing up children is a very labor-intensive activity. Furthermore, in the early part of the marriage, the husband is earlier in his career, so therefore he is not making a very large income. So that means that in the early part of a traditional marriage, the wife, in effect, is performing more and the husband less. And then the normal deal is that once the kids are more or less out of the house, or nowadays in a public school at least, the wife starts being able to take it easy, maybe she can play bridge, and the husband, being promoted in his firm, is getting them a better and better living. But there's obviously a potential problem if you stop making the contract enforceable, which is of course what happened in U.S. law over the last 30 or 40 years. That is, you got easy divorce. Furthermore, young women are more attractive to men than old women are. So there was the obvious potential for the man to renege on the contract and dump his wife once she had done her part and before he had done his part. How do women adjust to this? Well, there are two obvious things for them to do. One of them is to perform more slowly, to space out childbearing, have the first child later, so that they are no longer doing most of their part of the job at the beginning of the marriage. And the other is to specialize less in being the wife of that man and more in skills they can take with them, such as marketplace employment skills, which of course is what's happened. So that's a case where I think the economics explains both how a problem arose and how responding to that problem caused observable changes in the normal patterns of behavior. This one is an article called Marriage, Divorce, and Quasi-Rents, or I Gave Him the Best Years of My Life, by my friend Lloyd Cohen. I should say that Lloyd, I think, made a very serious tactical error in that article, because what he said was that women depreciate faster than men on the marriage market, with the result that feminists didn't like the article. Whereas if you actually think of the argument, which is that women perform early and men late in the marriage contract, and then the men double-cross the women, that's one that feminists should have been happy with. I told him that. He had already written the article. Let me go on to the economics of polygamy. And the interesting question is, what would be the effect of legalizing either polygyny or polyandry? Polygyny is multiple wives, polyandry is multiple husbands. And the natural view of a non-economist is that legalizing polygamy benefits men and harms women, that some men get multiple wives, and poor women have to share a man, whereas presumably legalizing polyandry would have the opposite. But that, of course, is wrong. And it's wrong because legalizing polygamy doesn't result in there being more women out there, right? Legalizing, think of the marriage as itself a kind of market, in which you've got not literal payments, but terms of marriage, such that if there are more men than women, then the men are going to find they've got to offer a good deal to their intended wives to get them to marry them. If there are more women than men, you'd expect the opposite pattern. All right? Well, now what happens when you legalize polygamy is that now the men who want one wife have to bid against the men who are willing to have two. You just increase the total demand for wives, because now a man can have more than one wife. Doesn't mean there are any more women, so that means you're going to bid up the price of a wife, just as what the effect would be if a bunch of women died and there was therefore a shortage of wives. And therefore, the men who get one wife, which is going to be almost all of them, of course, in practice in real polygamous societies, have to give her better terms. They've got to, in effect, pay her more to be their wife. And the men who get two wives, now they can get two instead of one, but they're getting two on worse terms for those. So the result is that women are better off, and that men who are monogamous are worse off, and men who are bigamous may or may not be worse off, depending on whether the increase in price more than balances the opportunity. And if that's not obvious, consider the effect of a law saying nobody can own more than one car. It would be to reduce the demand for cars. Now I should say, I'm assuming in all of this, because I'm in a modern society, that men and women own themselves. So if you were a society where who controls a woman's marriage is her father, then polygamy would make the fathers of the daughters better off, but not necessarily the daughters. Like in our modern society we're used to, it is your consent that's needed to get you married. Polyandry, you just reverse the argument. Polyandry would result in making men more expensive on the marriage market, and therefore making women worse off and men better off. This one is in my price theory textbook. I should say my price theory textbook is webbed on my site. There's a somewhat better and more polished version you can buy as a Kindle. I rewrote it as a book for the intelligent layman called Hidden Order, which is not on my site. It's not that expensive. Hidden Order. Basically, I had an aunt who I was very close to, and she had, and I gave her a copy of my price theory text, and she passed it on to her son, who passed it on to his daughter, who passed it on to her fiance, or maybe by that time husband, and I was told that he entertained the family at breakfast with bits from my Chrysler test. And after hearing that story, I just support the question. And the questions that we get asked are tariffs good or bad? Should we have minimum wages? And the natural answer of an economist is good, bad, should. What do you think I am, a philosopher? The philosophy department is down the hall. However, people keep asking these questions. And we finally answer, well, here we can offer you a definition of good. It's not a very good definition, but it's at least got a family resemblance to what you're looking for. And it's got the great virtue that we can actually answer your questions in terms of it. And that's what economists call economic efficiency. And the way to think of economic efficiency conceptually is imagine you're thinking of some change, such as imposing a minimum wage or a tariff or whatever. Suppose you could ask everybody affected by that change how much they would pay either to get it for themselves or to not get it for themselves, assuming that they knew what the effect on them would be. All right, so you say, all right, we're going to somehow let you live two different lives briefly and compare them. And then the life with or without the change. And then the question is, how much would you pay to have this one instead of that? And if you would pay a positive amount to get the change, we can call that a plus. If you pay a positive amount to prevent the change, we call it a minus. Add them all up. If the sum is positive, we call that an improvement in efficiency. If the sum is negative, we call it worsening. So for utilitarians in the room, that would be the equivalent to total utility, except that we're ignoring the fact that the marginal utility of $1 is different for different people. So I would argue that most of the time it's a pretty good proxy for total utility, because most of the time you're affecting large numbers of people and there's sort of a random sample, so some of them are people who value $1 highly and some less. And the really good thing about it is that we can actually observe it because we observe choices people make. Those choices reflect how much they value things. My very simplest example is that economists can say, allowing me to sell you an apple raises is the efficient solution, because either the apple is worth more dollars to me and you don't get it, then we're no worse off, or it's worth more dollars to you and you buy it, and then we're better off. So that's the form of the argument. That's the simplest version. Is the argument saying under these institutions, given that individuals will act according to their values, this will or will not increase economic efficiency. So it's not a very good answer, but I'm afraid we don't have any better. I'm not sure anybody else does. Let me go on to talk about the economics of law, which is what I've been doing for the last, until I retired, for about the last 30 years of my career at the University of Chicago Law School and then at Santa Clara University School of Law. Let me take a very simple case, which I actually used at the beginning of the book I wrote. Suppose that the maximum punishment in your society is life in prison. And somebody says, look, armed robbery is a very serious crime. We ought to give life in prison for armed robbery. And a moral philosopher says, is that just? And a constitutional scholar says, is it cruel and unusual punishment? And an economist says, you really want armed robbers to kill their victims. Because after all, if you're giving the maximum penalty for armed robbery, there is no additional penalty for murder, and if you kill somebody, you can't identify you. This is a slight oversimplification, which you could try a little harder to catch it, but nonetheless, it's the right first approximation. So that would be one example of applying economics to thinking about the law. This is what's called the problem of marginal deterrence. Let me give a different case. As you may know, we have two different legal systems called criminal law and tort law, which do the same work in different ways. All right? In each of them, you do something bad to somebody, and either someone calls the police and the government catches you, prosecutes you, or someone calls a lawyer and eventually you get sued. So in one case, the penalty is a fine or an imprisonment, in the other case it's a damage payment, but they are both basically ways of making it costly to do bad things to people. However, they have quite different standards of proof. The standard of proof for tort law is a preponderance of the evidence. Usually interpreted as a higher than 50% chance you're guilty. And the standard of proof for criminal law is beyond a reasonable doubt. There isn't an exact measure of that, but it's clearly something more than 50%. Why the difference? And it's tempting to say, well, criminal law is more serious, so we have to be more careful. But that's not really a good answer, because after all, tort damages could be $1 million. Criminal damages could be 2 weeks in jail. So that's not a very good explanation. However, the typical criminal punishment is one in which the criminal loses something that nobody gets. If you hang him, he loses a life and nobody gets a life. If you lock him up, not only does he lose his freedom for 5 years, but someone else has to pay for the prison. The typical tort punishment is simply a payment from the tortfeasor to his victim. So that, in a sense, has no net cost. One person is worse off, one person better off. Well, if you're imposing punishments which impose a large net cost, you want to be much more careful about not imposing them on the wrong person than if you're having punishment. Well, sometimes I pay you some money I shouldn't, and sometimes you pay me some money I shouldn't. It isn't the same. So I think that is at least a plausible explanation of the system. Now, I should say we don't really apply the criminal standard very consistently, because as you probably know, almost no criminals actually get trials. Almost all criminals plea bargain, and it's not at all clear what the standard of proof in practice is for that. But at least that's the theory of how the legal system works. Let me go on to the question that probably occurs to nobody but an economist, and that's what's wrong with theft. But after all, I've told you that our standard is summing gains and losses across everybody. So you pick my pocket, and I'm $100 poorer, and you're $100 richer. What's wrong with that? Why do we want laws against it? And the economist's answer is that we have to think about the market for theft. If you could make $100 very easily by stealing, then it will pay you to spend your resources, your time and your effort being a thief, instead of working at McDonald's or whatever your alternative employment activity is. And in fact, we can go a little further. Suppose what you can earn in a legal job is $10 an hour. As long as you can earn more than $10 an hour stealing, it will pay you to switch to stealing. Not just you, other people. As the number of thieves goes up, the returns from theft go down. You try to pick my pocket, and unfortunately you're a little bit late because someone else picked it 5 minutes ago. You try to pick somebody else's pocket, there's no money there because his money's in his shoe because he didn't want his pocket picked. So you have an equilibrium, just like in ordinary employment, where if a particular job pays very well, more people go into it, and that means it starts paying only as well as other jobs. Well, it works for illegal activities as well. So the result is that in the simplest case, the thief who steals $100 is devoting $100 worth of resources, his own time and effort that could be used working, to doing it, and therefore the society is in fact $100 worse off. Indeed, it may be more than $100 worse off, because the victim bears costs as well in protection. It's uncomfortable to wear my money in my shoe, especially if some of it's coins. So that means that in terms of the economics of theft, theft indeed has a large net burden, even though it appears at first glance to be transient. I should say, the first half of it, the actual cost may be less than the amount stolen, because there may be some people who are good at theft and bad at everything else. And therefore, in equilibrium, the marginal thief just breaks even, but the really talented thief makes a profit. But then you've got the costs at the other end for the people who then. Economists, starting with Gordon Tullock, have argued that this is a general category. The category nowadays is called rent-seeking, although Tullock doesn't use that term. That if you have a situation where people can get money by transfer rather than production, by activities such as theft, where I get money at your cost, then that will eat up real resources, because people will spend resources on being the one who gets the money and on not being the one who loses it. And that applies not only to illegal activity, it also applies to lobbying the government for tariffs. That after all, that's a costly activity, and that activity is being used in order to transfer not in order to produce. And in fact, Tulloch's article was called "The Welfare Costs of Tariffs, Monopolies, and Theft," because he argued that the traditional economic analysis of monopolies ignored the fact that if there was the potential for monopoly, it was worth losing money for some number of years, such that when that possibility existed, you would be the one in position to be the monopoly. And some other people pointed out that if you apply it to homesteading, you can argue that the decision to allocate land by homesteading is the worst mistake the U.S. government ever made. Because after all, if the first person to take this land gets the land, which is going to be valuable in the future, it pays to settle it prematurely. To be willing to lose money for the first 10 years so that you'll be the person who owns it when it becomes productive as the frontier moves out. And now I should say, it turns out if you look at it, that other ways of allocating the land also have problems for reasons I could go into, but I think I'm covering more of that than I need at the moment. But rent-seeking is in fact a general problem. I think Tulloch was the first person to write about it. I think I was the second in machinery in my discussion of the market for the political market for theft. And then Ann Kruger wrote an article which coined the term rent-seeking, so she usually gets the point. But it's a good term. Her example was exchange controls in poor countries. You had a country where they had set an official value for their money, which was well above its real value. And in order to get permission to trade, to buy dollars at the official rate for rupees, you had to have an import permit, which meant that that piece of paper was worth a large amount of money. And she estimated, as I remember, that India and Turkey were each burning up something like 5 or 10% of their GNP in the competition to get here. I mentioned criminal and civil law before, and that actually raises a puzzle that I find very interesting. And that is, why do we have both systems? And why do they differ as they do? That in tort law, an offense is treated as an offense against the victim. The victim files charges. The victim controls the prosecution. The victim can settle out of court if he likes. And if there is a damage payment, the victim collects. In criminal law, I hope you realize that none of you will ever be the victim of a crime. It is legally impossible for you to be the victim of a crime. All right? If somebody robs me, when that case gets to court, it is not Friedman versus Smith, it's the state of California versus Smith. Because the state of California is, legally speaking, the victim. And it is the state of California that prosecutes, that settles out of court, this is called a plea bargain, and that collects the fine if there is a fine. There are a lot of differences in the rules between the two, and so that raises the very interesting question of why some offenses are treated as torts and some as crimes, and why they differ as they do. And that could be a whole talk, so instead read my book Law's Order, which you can read a late draft of on my webpage, which was my book on economic analysis of law, in which I spend a chapter on exploring that question. And it's a question I really originally got into at the time when I originally got into doing economic analysis, because there was a controversy at the University of Chicago between two very prominent economists who eventually got Nobel Prizes, George Stigler and Gary Becker, and two very prominent University of Chicago law professors, one of whom, Richard Posner, is arguably the most influential modern legal scholar. He was chief judge of the Seventh Circuit for quite a while. And Becker and Stigler had pointed out that the standard system for enforcing criminal law was not incentive. That it was not in the interest of the players to act as they were supposed to. And my version of their argument goes as follows. You're a criminal, I'm a cop. And I've got the goods on you. I've got the evidence that will get you sentenced. And the punishment for that crime is, from your standpoint, equivalent to $100,000 fine. The benefit to me of getting you sent to prison is a gold star on my report card. That will raise my lifetime income from $10,000 by $10,000. And from the standpoint of crime dramas, we know what happens. I turn the evidence over to the DA and you go to prison. From the standpoint of economics, we know what happens too. Markets exist to move things to their highest value use, and the evidence against you is worth $10,000 to me and $100,000 to you. So you pay me off for $50,000 and I burn the evidence. And that means that in order for the criminal system to work, you need in effect a second layer of cops watching the first layer and maybe a third layer watching the second layer. I gather there is a more recent fictional portrayal of crime called The Wire, which gets some of this right. I haven't seen it. So what Becker and Stigler suggested was, look, there's a very simple solution to this problem. Instead of paying the policeman his salary, when you pay a $100,000 fine, he collects it. And of course, once you do that, the policeman doesn't have to be chosen by the state. He's just the person who collects it. And Becker and Stigler then wrote an article pointing out some problems with this proposal, but also pointing out what had not occurred to Becker and Stigler, that they had just reinvented tort law. And I got interested. I was not doing law and econ at the time, and I got interested for two different reasons. One of them was that there was a part of the Becker and Stigler article where they were arguing that the proposal could not solve a certain problem, and I had a way of solving that problem. So I wrote an article and published it in one of the Chicago journals. But the other reason was that I thought I knew of a society that had run that way. A society in which when you killed somebody, his relatives sued you. That was Saga period Iceland, which I knew a certain amount about, but not enough. So I wrote a second article in which I tried to work out as best I could how the Icelandic legal system of 1,000 years ago worked, how it dealt with the various problems and so forth. And so I published that article too. And Landis and Posner invited me to come to Chicago to argue with them in closer range. So that's how I ended up spending 8 or 10 years as a faculty fellow on a one-year invitation to Chicago, and then ended up going into law and econ in California after Landis and Posner failed to persuade their colleagues that they needed another economist on the faculty of the law school. So that's particularly interesting to me, at least. So for more stuff on a lot of this, my website is daviddfriedman.com. You do need the D, which is my middle initial. If I had applied for that 6 months earlier, I could have gone to davidfriedman.com, but someone else beat me to it. It has a link to my blog, which is not very active at the moment. It's got 15 years or 16 years of essays on all sorts of different topics, including some of these. My price theory, as I say, is webbed on my site. Law's Order, a late draft of Law's Order, is webbed on my, in fact, a final draft is also webbed on my site. And The Machinery of Freedom, the second edition, is webbed on my site. For the third edition, which has another 100 pages, you have to either buy a Kindle or buy a text, but they're fairly inexpensive, because I regard writing books mainly as a way of spreading ideas, not mainly as a source of income, so I make things as cheap as I reason. Any questions?
Yeah, I was thinking the government taxation of the public essentially kicking the pockets.